The morning fog clung to the Blue Ridge Mountains like smoke from a dying fire. But Samuel Benjamin Parsons could see clearly enough to know that something was terribly wrong with his chestnut trees. October 15th, 1924 would be remembered as the day the giants began to die, though nobody in Cabell County, West Virginia would understand the real reason for nearly 30 years. Before we dive into how one man's quest for revenge would poison an entire mountain ecosystem, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Samuel stood 4 feet 3 inches tall in his work boots, but every person in these Appalachian hollows knew better than to measure a man by his height alone. At 47 years old, Sam had earned respect through 3 decades of botanical knowledge that surpassed anything the agricultural college professors could teach. His 100-acre chestnut grove represented the largest private orchard in the region, producing nuts that fed families throughout the mountains and generated enough income to support his wife Margaret and their 2 children. The American chestnut trees that dominated Sam's property were true giants, some reaching heights of over 80 feet, with trunks 6 feet in diameter. These ancient monarchs had stood for centuries before European settlers arrived, their massive canopies providing shade for entire homesteads, and their yearly nut harvest sustaining both wildlife and mountain families through harsh winters. Sam's grandfather had recognized the tree's value when he purchased the land in 1867, but it was Sam who had developed the scientific expertise to maximize their productivity. Samuel's expertise came from years of correspondence with botanists at universities throughout the eastern United States, combined with practical knowledge gained through decades of careful observation. He understood soil composition, grafting techniques, pest management, and harvest optimization in ways that allowed his trees to produce yields that other growers considered impossible. The Parsons chestnuts were legendary throughout West Virginia for their size, flavor, and consistent quality. But this morning, as Sam walked his regular inspection route through groves that had thrived under his care for 25 years, he discovered something that made his blood run cold. Yellow-brown leaves scattered the forest floor weeks ahead of their normal autumn drop. Bark showed signs of stress that he'd never observed before. Most disturbing of all, several of his largest trees displayed dying branches that suggested systemic illness rather than seasonal change. Sam's knowledge of tree diseases was comprehensive, acquired through years of studying agricultural publications and consulting with experts who respected his practical experience. He could identify fungal infections, insect damage, drought stress, and nutrient deficiencies with the precision of a medical doctor diagnosing human illness. But what he observed this morning didn't match any condition he'd encountered in his extensive reading or 25 years of hands-on experience. The pattern of decline was too uniform to be natural, too widespread to be coincidental, and too sudden to be explained by environmental factors. Sam had monitored these trees daily throughout the growing season, documenting their health with the meticulous records that had made his orchard famous among agricultural specialists. The symptoms he observed this morning had appeared virtually overnight, suggesting external causes rather than natural disease progression. Margaret Parsons found her husband sitting at their kitchen table 3 hours later, surrounded by botanical references and agricultural journals, his face carrying the expression of someone who'd just realized that everything he'd worked for was threatened by something he couldn't identify or control. "Samuel," she said gently, recognizing the signs of her husband's deepest concentration. "You missed breakfast, and the children are asking why you look so worried." Sam looked up from his research with eyes that reflected 30 years of accumulated botanical knowledge, confronting a problem that didn't appear in any textbook. "Maggie, something's killing our trees. Something I've never seen before, something that doesn't match any disease or pest I know about." Margaret had lived in these mountains her entire life, and she'd learned to trust her husband's expertise in matters concerning their livelihood. When Sam worried about the chestnut trees, she worried too. Their family's financial security depended entirely on the annual nut harvest that had sustained them through economic recessions, crop failures, and medical emergencies. "How bad is it?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already feared the answer. Sam's response carried the weight of someone who'd spent the morning calculating the potential destruction of everything his family had built. "If this continues at the rate I observe today, we could lose the entire grove within 2 growing seasons. 25 years of work, gone." The implications extended far beyond the Parsons family's financial survival. Sam's chestnut grove employed 12 local families during harvest season, provided nuts for over 40 mountain households that depended on them for winter protein, and served as a seed source for other growers throughout the region who were trying to establish their own orchards. But Sam's expertise told him that natural diseases didn't progress with the uniformity he'd observed. Fungal infections spread gradually from tree to tree through spore transmission that created irregular patterns of decline. Insect infestations typically affected younger trees before older ones, and drought stress would impact trees in exposed locations before those in protected areas. What he'd witnessed this morning suggested something far more systematic. As Sam returned to his grove that afternoon, he began documenting the progression of symptoms with a scientific precision that had made his agricultural correspondence valuable to university researchers. He measured bark discoloration, collected leaf samples, and photographed the distribution of affected trees with equipment that most mountain farmers couldn't afford, but which Sam considered essential tools of his trade. The pattern that emerged from his documentation confirmed his worst suspicions. The tree mortality wasn't following natural disease vectors or environmental stress patterns. Instead, it appeared to be progressing outward from specific locations within the grove, as if something had been deliberately introduced at multiple points throughout his property. Sam's mind began considering possibilities that his scientific training told him were unlikely, but which his practical experience suggested might explain the symptoms he'd observed. Someone with knowledge of tree physiology could potentially introduce toxins or pathogens that would create the kind of systematic decline he was witnessing. But that would require both botanical expertise and deliberate malicious intent, a combination that seemed impossible in rural mountain communities where neighbors helped each other survive difficult times. As evening approached, Sam walked the perimeter of his property, looking for evidence of human activity that might explain the mysterious onset of tree disease. What he discovered near the eastern boundary of his grove made his suspicions crystallize into cold certainty that someone was deliberately destroying his life's work. Boot prints in soft soil showed evidence of recent nighttime activity in areas where no legitimate visitor would have reason to travel. Several trees near the property line displayed small holes drilled into their trunks, holes that had been carefully concealed but which Sam's expert eye could identify as artificial rather than natural insect damage. The holes were positioned at precisely the height where injected toxins would be most effectively absorbed into the tree's vascular systems. Their location, spacing, and depth indicated someone with sophisticated understanding of tree physiology, knowledge that few people in the region possessed. Someone had been systematically poisoning Sam's chestnut trees with methods that would create delayed symptoms designed to avoid immediate detection. Sam spent that night reviewing his interactions with everyone who might possess both the botanical knowledge and the motivation to destroy his orchard. The list was disturbingly short. Only 3 people in the region had sufficient expertise to plan and execute such a sophisticated attack. Dr. William Hartwell, the agricultural extension agent, Professor James Mackenzie, who taught botany at the county college, and Thomas Big Tom Morrison, a fellow chestnut grower whose property adjoined Sam's eastern boundary. Dr. Hartwell had always treated Sam with professional respect, often consulting with him about local growing conditions and recommending his expertise to other farmers. Professor Mackenzie had invited Sam to speak to his botany classes on 3 occasions, praising his practical knowledge in front of academic audiences. But Thomas Morrison represented a different category of relationship entirely. Big Tom Morrison stood 6 feet, 4 inches tall, and weighed over 250 pounds, his imposing physical presence matched by a personality that dominated every social situation. For 5 years, Morrison had been pressuring Sam to sell his property, making increasingly aggressive offers that Sam had politely but firmly refused. Morrison's own chestnut operation was smaller and less productive than Sam's, a fact that clearly frustrated someone accustomed to being the most successful person in any endeavor. The conflict between Sam and Morrison had escalated 6 months earlier, when Sam had refused Morrison's final offer to purchase the property. Morrison's response had been delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that large men sometimes used against those they considered physically inferior. "Listen here, little man, there ain't room in this county for 2 chestnut operations, and I guarantee you mine's going to be the one that survives." At the time, Sam had interpreted Morrison's words as empty bravado from someone frustrated by repeated business rejections. But the evidence he'd discovered this afternoon suggested that Morrison's threat might have been a promise, rather than bluster. Sam's analysis of the attack pattern indicated extensive knowledge of his grove's layout, detailed understanding of tree physiology, and access to botanical toxins that weren't readily available to amateur growers. Morrison possessed all three requirements. He'd visited Sam's property multiple times over the years, he'd studied agricultural science before inheriting his family's farm, and he had connections with chemical suppliers who served commercial agricultural operations. As Sam sat in his kitchen that night, reviewing evidence that pointed towards systematic sabotage by someone he'd considered a professional rival rather than a personal enemy, he felt something cold settle in his chest. Morrison wasn't just trying to eliminate business competition. He was attempting to destroy a man's livelihood through methods that violated every principle of mountain community cooperation. Margaret found her husband still awake at 3 a.m., surrounded by botanical references and handwritten calculations that documented the extent of damage their family was facing. "Samuel, you need to sleep. Whatever's happening to the trees, you'll handle it better after rest." But Sam's mind was already working through implications that extended far beyond immediate tree loss. If Morrison had indeed initiated a campaign of botanical sabotage, the attack wouldn't stop with the current poisoning. Morrison would continue applying pressure until Sam's family was forced to abandon everything they'd built, leaving Morrison as the dominant chestnut producer in the region. "Maggie," Sam said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of decisions that couldn't be unmade. "If someone's deliberately killing our trees, we have to decide whether we're going to let them destroy our family or whether we're going to fight back." Margaret understood her husband well enough to recognize the dangerous calm in his voice. In 22 years of marriage, she'd learned that Sam's quiet determination could be more formidable than other men's explosive anger. When Sam decided to fight, he fought with the patient precision of someone who understood that victory sometimes required methods that couldn't be discussed with neighbors or documented in official records. "What are you thinking?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already feared the direction of his thoughts. Sam's answer carried the finality of someone who'd just realized that his family's survival might require violating principles he'd spent his entire life defending. "I'm thinking that whoever's poisoning our trees needs to understand that some people are more dangerous when they're pushed than when they're left alone." The stage was set for a conflict that would test everything Sam Parsons believed about justice, survival, and the lengths a man would go to protect his family's livelihood. Morrison's attack had been sophisticated and calculated, designed to destroy Sam's trees slowly enough to avoid immediate detection, while ensuring that the financial devastation would be complete. But Morrison had made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that Sam's small stature indicated weakness, rather than understanding that some of the most dangerous opponents came in packages that larger men underestimated. Sam Parsons possessed botanical knowledge that could be used for creation or destruction, and Morrison was about to discover which application Sam would choose when his family's survival was threatened. The war between the giants and the dwarf was about to begin, and the Appalachian Mountains would never be the same. The first killing frost of November 1924 arrived 3 weeks early, but Samuel Parsons barely noticed the crystalline coating on his cabin windows as he studied the laboratory results that confirmed his worst suspicions. Dr. Helena Blackwood from the Agricultural College had spent 2 weeks analyzing the leaf and bark samples Sam had collected, and her findings painted a picture of deliberate botanical warfare that exceeded anything Sam had imagined possible. "Mr. Parsons," Dr. Blackwood had written in her detailed report, "the toxin residue in your samples indicates systematic application of copper sulfate mixed with arsenic compounds, a combination that would require considerable chemical knowledge to prepare and apply effectively. This is not accidental contamination or natural disease. Someone with substantial expertise in plant physiology has deliberately poisoned your trees." Sam read the report for the 4th time, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he absorbed the implications of Dr. Blackwood's analysis. The chemical compound identified in his trees wasn't something that could be purchased at local farming supply stores. It had to be specially prepared by someone with access to laboratory equipment and knowledge of botanical chemistry that few people in rural West Virginia possessed. The evidence pointed inexorably toward Thomas Morrison, whose family had operated a commercial fertilizer business before transitioning to chestnut growing. Morrison's barn contained chemicals and equipment that could easily be used to prepare the toxin mixture Dr. Blackwood had identified. More importantly, Morrison possessed the botanical knowledge necessary to understand how such poisons would affect tree physiology over time. But Sam's investigation had uncovered something even more disturbing than simple business competition. Over the past month, he'd quietly interviewed neighbors and discovered that Morrison had been systematically spreading rumors about Sam's grove being infected with diseases that could spread to other properties. Morrison was apparently preparing the community to accept the destruction of Sam's trees as necessary pest control rather than recognizing it as deliberate sabotage. Samuel, Margaret said as she placed a cup of coffee beside his papers, "You've been studying those reports for hours. What exactly are you planning to do with this information?" Sam looked up at his wife with eyes that reflected 6 weeks of accumulated anger and determination. At 47, he'd spent his entire adult life building something valuable through patient, methodical work. Morrison's attack wasn't just threatening their financial security. It was destroying decades of botanical achievement that represented Sam's contribution to agricultural science. "I'm planning to teach Tom Morrison that some people are more dangerous than they appear," Sam replied, his voice carrying the quiet intensity that Margaret had learned to recognize as her husband's most serious mood. "He thinks he can destroy our family because he's bigger and stronger. But size isn't the only kind of power, and Morrison's about to learn what happens when you attack someone who knows more about plant chemistry than you do." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November weather. She'd been married to Sam long enough to understand that his methodical intelligence could be applied to destruction as easily as creation. When Sam decided to solve a problem, he approached it with the same systematic precision that had made his Chestnut Grove legendary throughout the region. "What do you mean?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already feared the direction of her husband's thoughts. Sam stood and walked to his bookshelf, pulling down agricultural texts and chemistry references that most mountain farmers wouldn't recognize. His correspondence with university researchers over the years had provided him with knowledge that extended far beyond tree cultivation into areas of botanical science that could be used for purposes Morrison would never anticipate. "Tom Morrison poisoned our trees using chemicals he understands," Sam explained, his voice carrying the calm that preceded his most carefully planned actions. "But there are other compounds, other applications, other ways to affect plant growth that Morrison's never studied. If he wants to wage botanical warfare, he's going to discover that he's fighting someone who knows the subject better than he does." Sam's plan began to take shape over the following week as he reviewed his extensive collection of agricultural literature and chemical references. Morrison had used copper sulfate and arsenic, crude but effective toxins that killed trees slowly through systemic poisoning. But Sam's research had introduced him to botanical compounds that could be far more sophisticated in their application and devastating in their effects. The November morning when Sam began gathering materials for his retaliation was clear and cold, with frost coating the mountain ridges like crystallized moonlight. He drove his wagon to 3 different towns, purchasing chemicals and supplies from sources that wouldn't remember his transactions or connect his purchases to any particular agricultural application. Each item was ordinary when bought separately, but combined according to formulas Sam had discovered in university research papers, they would create compounds that Morrison's limited chemical knowledge couldn't identify or counter. Sam's first target wasn't Morrison's trees. That would be too obvious and might provoke retaliation that could escalate beyond botanical warfare. Instead, Sam focused on something that would hurt Morrison financially while appearing to be natural crop failure that couldn't be traced to human intervention. Morrison's secondary income came from a 5-acre vegetable garden that supplied produce to local markets throughout the growing season. The garden represented approximately 30% of Morrison's annual earnings, enough to matter significantly but not enough to threaten his basic survival. Sam's attack would eliminate this income, while creating conditions that would suggest natural soil depletion rather than deliberate sabotage. The compound Sam prepared was far more sophisticated than Morrison's crude toxin mixture. Using knowledge gained from his correspondence with soil chemistry researchers, Sam created a formula that would gradually alter the pH balance of Morrison's garden soil, making it increasingly hostile to vegetable cultivation while appearing to be natural acidification that could affect any mountain property. The application required 3 nighttime visits to Morrison's property, spread across 2 weeks to avoid creating obvious patterns that might suggest human intervention. Sam's small stature became an advantage during these operations, allowing him to move through Morrison's property without detection, while applying his chemical mixture with the precision of someone who understood exactly how soil chemistry affected plant growth. During his first reconnaissance mission, Sam discovered something that made his blood run cold. Hidden in Morrison's barn, carefully concealed behind legitimate farming equipment, was a sophisticated laboratory setup that included chemical preparation equipment far beyond what any normal chestnut grower would require. Glass beakers, precision scales, and chemical storage containers suggested that Morrison had been planning botanical attacks for months, possibly years. More disturbing still, Sam found detailed maps of his property with notations indicating optimal locations for toxin application. Morrison's attack hadn't been spontaneous retaliation for rejected business offers. It had been a carefully planned campaign designed to systematically destroy Sam's livelihood while avoiding detection by authorities who wouldn't understand the sophisticated nature of botanical sabotage. The discovery transformed Sam's approach from simple retaliation to comprehensive warfare. Morrison wasn't just a business rival who'd crossed ethical lines. He was apparently a predator who specialized in using botanical knowledge to destroy competitors through methods that legal authorities couldn't recognize or prosecute. Sam's response would need to be equally sophisticated and far more devastating. On his second visit to Morrison's property, Sam applied his soil acidification compound throughout the vegetable garden, while also introducing trace amounts of chemicals that would create iron deficiency in Morrison's soil. The combination would gradually weaken plant growth, while creating symptoms that agricultural extension agents would diagnose as natural mineral depletion, requiring expensive soil remediation. But Sam's real masterpiece was saved for Morrison's prized apple orchard, a 20-tree grove that Morrison had inherited from his father, and which represented his primary source of winter income. Sam's formula for attacking the apple trees was based on research he discovered in European agricultural journals. Compounds that would create delayed dormancy break in spring, causing the trees to bloom at irregular intervals that would virtually eliminate fruit production for at least 2 growing seasons. The chemical mixture required precise application timing to coincide with the tree's winter dormancy cycle. Sam's third visit to Morrison's property took place during a December snowstorm that provided perfect concealment while allowing him to treat each apple tree with compounds that would disrupt their natural spring awakening without creating obvious symptoms of external interference. By January 1925, Morrison's vegetable garden soil had become noticeably less productive, with test plantings showing poor germination and weak growth that suggested serious nutritional deficiencies. Morrison consulted with the Agricultural Extension Office, receiving advice about soil testing and mineral supplements that would cost him significant money while failing to address the real cause of his garden's decline. The apple orchard's problems wouldn't become apparent until spring, when Morrison would discover that his trees' blooming cycles had become so irregular that pollination would be virtually impossible. The delayed symptoms meant that Morrison would spend months trying to identify natural causes for problems that had no natural solutions. But Sam's campaign extended beyond simple crop sabotage. Using his network of contacts throughout the agricultural community, he began systematically undermining Morrison's reputation as a knowledgeable grower. Subtle comments to other farmers about Morrison's declining crop yields carefully planted suggestions that Morrison's farming practices might be responsible for regional pest problems and strategic recommendations that people seek agricultural advice from more experienced sources. The psychological pressure on Morrison intensified when his attempts to diagnose his crop problems led him to consult with the same experts who'd been influenced by Sam's reputation management campaign. Agricultural extension agents who'd previously respected Morrison's knowledge began treating him as an amateur who'd gotten in over his head, recommending expensive solutions that failed to address problems Morrison couldn't identify. Margaret watched her husband's systematic campaign with growing unease. Sam's methodical destruction of Morrison's agricultural reputation was more sophisticated than anything she'd expected, demonstrating capabilities that seemed almost frightening in their precision and effectiveness. "Samuel," she said one evening as her husband reviewed agricultural journals for additional compounds that might serve his purposes, "when is this going to end? You've already cost Morrison significant money and damaged his reputation. Isn't that enough revenge for what he did to our trees?" Sam looked up from his research with eyes that reflected months of careful planning and absolute determination. "Maggie, Morrison didn't just attack our trees. He attacked our family's future, our children's inheritance, everything we've built over 25 years. He did it with methods designed to avoid consequences, thinking he was too smart to be caught or challenged. Sam's voice carried the weight of someone who'd discovered that his opponent was far more dangerous than initial appearances had suggested. But Morrison made one crucial mistake. He assumed that because I'm smaller than him, I must be weaker. He never considered that some kinds of knowledge are more powerful than physical size, and some kinds of warfare are more devastating than direct confrontation. Margaret understood that her husband had crossed a line that separated defensive retaliation from systematic destruction. Sam wasn't just fighting back against Morrison's attack. He was demonstrating that challenging Samuel Parsons came with consequences that extended far beyond immediate business conflicts. The February morning when Morrison discovered his apple tree's irregular blooming cycle marked the beginning of his understanding that he was facing an opponent whose capabilities exceeded anything he'd anticipated. The sight of his orchard producing scattered blossoms at random intervals throughout the month should have been impossible according to everything Morrison knew about tree physiology. But the real revelation came when Morrison's soil tests revealed chemical imbalances that couldn't be explained by natural environmental factors. The combination of acidification and mineral deficiencies affecting his property suggested systematic interference by someone with sophisticated knowledge of agricultural chemistry. As Morrison stood in his ruined garden, staring at soil that had become hostile to plant growth through processes he couldn't understand or reverse, he began to suspect that his attack on Sam Parsons had provoked retaliation from an opponent far more dangerous than he'd realized. The war between the giants and the dwarf was escalating beyond simple crop sabotage into a conflict that would test everything both men believed about intelligence versus strength, knowledge versus intimidation, and the ultimate consequences of underestimating opponents who possessed capabilities that couldn't be measured by physical appearance. Morrison was about to discover that Samuel Parsons had resources, knowledge, and determination that made him far more formidable than his size suggested. And Sam was preparing to teach Morrison a lesson that would redefine his understanding of who could be threatened and who was too dangerous to challenge. The March morning when Thomas Morrison finally understood the true extent of his agricultural disaster dawned cold and gray, with storm clouds gathering over the Blue Ridge Mountains like an omen of the violence that was about to engulf Cabell County. Morrison stood in what had once been his productive vegetable garden, staring at soil that refused to support plant life, despite thousands of dollars invested in fertilizers and soil amendments that had proved utterly useless. At 6 feet 4 inches and weighing 260 pounds, Big Tom Morrison had never encountered a problem he couldn't solve through physical intimidation or brute force application of superior resources. But the systematic destruction of his agricultural livelihood had been accomplished through methods so sophisticated that 3 different agricultural experts had failed to identify the real cause of his crop failures, leaving him financially devastated and professionally humiliated. The soil test results scattered across his kitchen table told a story of chemical sabotage that exceeded anything Morrison had thought possible from a mountain farmer he'd dismissed as an educated but physically insignificant opponent. pH levels that fluctuated wildly despite mineral applications, trace elements that appeared and disappeared according to no natural pattern, and organic compounds that shouldn't exist in agricultural soil under any normal circumstances. Tom, his wife Clara, said as she placed coffee beside the stack of laboratory reports, "Dr. Henderson from the Agricultural College wants to use our property as a case study for unexplained soil chemistry problems. He thinks whatever's affecting our land might be some kind of new environmental contamination that could help other farmers." Morrison looked up from the reports with eyes that reflected 6 months of accumulated frustration and the growing suspicion that his crop failures weren't coincidental. "Clara, Dr. Henderson doesn't understand what's really happening here. This isn't environmental contamination or natural soil depletion. Someone with sophisticated chemical knowledge has been systematically poisoning our property." The admission hung in the kitchen air like smoke from a house fire. For months, Morrison had refused to acknowledge that his agricultural disaster might be the result of human intervention, preferring to believe that complex soil chemistry problems could be solved through conventional farming methods. But the evidence had become too overwhelming to deny. Clara Morrison had lived in these mountains her entire life, and she understood community dynamics well enough to recognize when her husband's business conflicts might escalate into personal warfare. "Tom, if someone's deliberately sabotaging our crops, who would have the knowledge and motivation to plan something this sophisticated?" Morrison's answer came through teeth clenched, with the kind of rage that had made him dangerous in physical confrontations throughout his adult life. Samuel Parsons. That little bastard has been systematically destroying everything we've built, using methods I never thought possible from someone I considered a harmless academic. The realization that Sam Parsons possessed capabilities Morrison had never suspected created a cold fury that transformed his approach from business competition to personal vendetta. Morrison had attacked Sam's Chestnut Grove expecting easy victory over someone whose small stature suggested weakness, rather than understanding the difference between physical size and intellectual weaponry. But Sam's retaliation had proved far more devastating than Morrison's original sabotage. While Morrison had simply poisoned trees that could be replanted, Sam had rendered Morrison's soil hostile to agriculture through chemical alterations that might take decades to reverse naturally. The sophistication of Sam's attack indicated planning and knowledge that extended far beyond anything Morrison had anticipated from his diminutive opponent. Morrison spent that afternoon reviewing his own agricultural records, trying to understand how Sam had gained access to his property and applied chemicals without detection. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Every incident of crop failure corresponded with nights when weather conditions would have provided perfect concealment for someone conducting covert operations on his land. More disturbing still, Morrison's barn showed subtle signs of repeated entry by someone familiar with his property layout. Tools had been moved slightly, chemical containers showed evidence of sampling, and his agricultural equipment displayed trace residues that suggested systematic surveillance by an opponent who'd studied his farming methods with scientific precision. The evidence painted a picture of systematic intelligence gathering that had preceded Sam's chemical attacks by weeks or possibly months. Morrison realized that while he'd been planning crude toxin application to Sam's trees, Sam had been conducting comprehensive reconnaissance that allowed him to design retaliation specifically tailored to Morrison's vulnerabilities. That son of a bitch has been playing chess while I was playing checkers. Morrison muttered as he examined chemical residues that proved Sam had been analyzing his agricultural methods before designing countermeasures that exploited weaknesses Morrison hadn't known existed. But Morrison's discovery of Sam's superior tactical thinking only intensified his determination to escalate the conflict beyond botanical warfare into territory where his physical advantages would prove decisive. If Sam wanted to fight through chemistry and intellectual superiority, Morrison would demonstrate that some problems required solutions that couldn't be found in agricultural journals. The plan Morrison developed that evening was built on 42 years of understanding how physical intimidation worked in mountain communities where law enforcement was limited and neighbors minded their own business. Sam might possess superior knowledge of agricultural chemistry, but Morrison understood violence in ways that academic expertise couldn't counter. Morrison's approach would target Sam's family rather than his crops, demonstrating that chemical warfare could be answered through methods that made botanical sabotage seem gentle by comparison. Margaret Parsons drove to town every Tuesday for supplies, following predictable routes through isolated mountain roads where accidents could happen without witnesses. Sam's children walked to school along paths that passed through forest where people could disappear without anyone knowing who was responsible. The psychological pressure Morrison planned would force Sam to choose between continuing his agricultural attacks and protecting his family from escalating threats that legal authorities couldn't prevent or prosecute. Mountain communities had their own ways of settling disputes that extended beyond property damage into areas where men learned the real costs of making enemies who specialized in violence rather than chemistry. But Morrison's planning was interrupted by intelligence that changed his understanding of what he was facing. His neighbor, Dale Hoffman, approached him that evening with information that painted a far more dangerous picture of Samuel Parsons than anything Morrison had previously considered. "Tom," Hoffman said, his voice carrying the careful tone mountain people used when discussing potentially dangerous topics, "you asked me to keep my ears open about Sam Parsons and his family. Well, I've been talking to folks who've known Sam longer than most of us, and there's things about that man you probably ought to know before this situation gets any worse." Morrison invited Hoffman into his kitchen, pouring whiskey while his neighbor gathered thoughts about information that clearly made him uncomfortable. Dale Hoffman had lived in these mountains for 60 years, and his reluctance to discuss Sam Parsons suggested knowledge that extended beyond simple agricultural expertise. "What kind of things?" Morrison asked, though his tone indicated he was preparing for information that might complicate his plans for escalating the conflict. Hoffman's response changed everything Morrison thought he understood about his diminutive opponent. Sam Parsons spent 2 years in France during the war, attached to some kind of chemical unit that specialized in things the Army doesn't talk about publicly. Word is he came back knowing more about poison applications than any farmer ought to understand. And Tom, there's stories about what happened to people who crossed Sam's family during the mine strikes of '02. The information hit Morrison like a physical blow. Sam's agricultural expertise wasn't just academic knowledge gained through correspondence with university researchers. It was apparently supplemented by military experience in chemical warfare that had provided practical knowledge about toxin applications under combat conditions. "What kind of stories?" Morrison asked, his voice reflecting the growing unease of someone discovering that his opponent possessed capabilities extending far beyond botanical sabotage. Hoffman's answer was delivered with the reluctance of someone discussing events that mountain communities preferred to forget. 3 men who tried to pressure Sam's father during the mine unionization ended up dead from what looked like natural causes: heart failure, respiratory problems, sudden illnesses that doctors couldn't explain. Never any proof of foul play, but folks who knew the family understood that crossing the Parsons clan came with health risks that couldn't be cured by medical attention. Morrison felt something cold settle in his chest as he absorbed the implications of Hoffman's intelligence. Sam's retaliation for the Chestnut Grove attack wasn't just sophisticated agricultural sabotage. It was apparently a restrained response from someone whose capabilities included methods that could eliminate human targets as easily as destroying crops. The realization that Sam possessed knowledge and experience in areas extending far beyond plant chemistry forced Morrison to reconsider his plans for escalating the conflict through threats against Sam's family. If Sam had indeed eliminated human opponents during previous conflicts, Morrison's intimidation tactics might provoke responses that would put his own family at risk. But Morrison's pride and accumulated rage over 6 months of agricultural humiliation made retreat impossible, even when faced with evidence that his opponent was far more dangerous than initial appearances had suggested. Morrison had built his reputation through physical dominance of situations that required strength rather than intelligence, and acknowledging defeat by someone half his size would destroy everything he'd established about his position in the community hierarchy. "Dale," Morrison said after finishing his whiskey, "I appreciate the warning, but I've come too far to back down now. Sam Parsons has cost me thousands of dollars and made me look like a fool in front of the entire county. If he thinks his reputation for chemical expertise is going to scare me off, he's about to learn that some problems require solutions that can't be found in military manuals or agricultural journals." Hoffman's expression suggested he delivered his warning and fulfilled his obligation to prevent unnecessary violence. But he understood mountain pride well enough to know that Morrison had passed the point where rational consideration of consequences could influence his decisions. "Just remember, Tom, that some men are more dangerous than they appear, and some fights don't end the way you expect them to," Hoffman said as he prepared to leave. "Sam Parsons might look like a harmless academic, but he's got resources and knowledge that make him a lot more formidable than his size suggests." After Hoffman left, Morrison spent the evening planning an escalation that would force Sam to understand that chemical warfare could be answered through methods that made botanical sabotage seem like childhood games. The plan Morrison developed was designed to demonstrate that physical intimidation remained the ultimate arbitrator of disputes between men, regardless of academic expertise or military experience. Morrison's approach would begin with a direct confrontation that established the terms under which their conflict would be resolved. No more subtle chemical applications or sophisticated agricultural sabotage. No more hiding behind intellectual superiority or technical knowledge. Just 2 men settling their differences through methods that had governed mountain disputes since before academic colleges existed to teach chemical warfare. The March evening when Morrison drove to Sam's property was cold and clear, with stars visible through mountain air that seemed to anticipate the violence that was about to transform their conflict from agricultural warfare into something far more primitive and final. Morrison carried a shotgun and the absolute confidence that 42 years of physical dominance had given him in situations that required strength rather than intelligence. But as Morrison's truck wound up the mountain road toward Sam's cabin, he had no way of knowing that his opponent had been anticipating this escalation for weeks, preparing for the moment when Morrison's frustration with chemical defeat would drive him to attempt solutions that relied on intimidation rather than expertise. Sam Parsons was waiting in his kitchen, surrounded by chemical preparations that extended far beyond agricultural applications, ready to demonstrate that some opponents were more dangerous when cornered than when left alone. Morrison was driving toward a confrontation that would either establish his physical dominance or prove that intelligence combined with chemical knowledge could overcome any advantage that size and strength might provide. The stage was set for a final test of everything both men believed about power, intelligence, and the ultimate methods of settling disputes that couldn't be resolved through civilized means. Morrison was about to discover whether his reputation for physical intimidation could overcome an opponent whose capabilities extended into areas where size meant nothing and knowledge meant everything. The war between the giant and the dwarf was approaching its climax, and only one man would emerge with his reputation, his family, and his life intact. The mountain silence of that March evening was broken only by the sound of Thomas Morrison's truck engine laboring up the steep grade towards Samuel Parsons' cabin, carrying with it the weight of 6 months of accumulated rage and the promise of violence that would either restore Morrison's dominance or destroy him completely. The stars above Cabell County seemed unusually bright, as if nature itself was preparing to witness a confrontation that would redefine everything the mountain community understood about power, intelligence, and the ultimate consequences of underestimating opponents whose capabilities couldn't be measured by physical appearance. Samuel Parsons heard Morrison's approach long before the truck's headlights appeared through the trees surrounding his property. Sam had been expecting this escalation since February, when Morrison's agricultural disasters had become too overwhelming for pride to ignore and too systematic for coincidence to explain. The sound of the laboring engine told Sam everything he needed to know. Morrison was coming alone at night, probably armed, and certainly desperate enough to attempt solutions that relied on intimidation rather than intelligence. Sam's preparation for this moment had been as methodical as everything else he'd undertaken in his 47 years of life. His kitchen table was arranged with materials that appeared innocent to casual observation, but which represented the accumulated knowledge of someone whose expertise in chemical applications extended far beyond agricultural uses. Glass containers held compounds that had been refined through techniques Sam had learned in French trenches where chemical warfare was a daily reality rather than academic theory. Margaret Parsons and their 2 children had been quietly relocated to her sister's home in Charleston 3 days earlier, ostensibly for an extended family visit, but actually to ensure that Morrison's escalation wouldn't threaten innocent family members. Sam's military experience had taught him that desperate men often targeted civilians when direct confrontation seemed impossible, and he'd taken precautions that would protect his loved ones, regardless of how the evening's confrontation developed. Samuel, Margaret had said before leaving, her voice carrying 22 years of accumulated trust and the intuitive understanding that mountain wives developed about their husbands' dangerous capabilities. Tom Morrison is twice your size and probably armed. Are you certain you can handle whatever he's planning? Sam's response had carried the quiet confidence of someone whose knowledge extended into areas where physical size meant nothing, and proper preparation meant everything. Maggie, I spent 2 years in France learning how to neutralize opponents who possessed every advantage except knowledge. Morrison's bigger and stronger, but he's about to discover that some kinds of power can't be overcome through intimidation or brute force. Now, as Morrison's truck pulled into the clearing in front of Sam's cabin, Sam felt the familiar calm that had sustained him through chemical attacks at Belleau Wood and gas bombardments at Chateau Thierry. Combat had taught him that survival often depended on patience, preparation, and the willingness to use whatever methods were necessary to eliminate threats that couldn't be reasoned with or avoided. Morrison stepped out of his truck carrying a double-barrel shotgun, with the confident swagger of someone who'd spent 42 years dominating situations through physical presence and the implicit threat of violence. At 6 feet 4 inches and weighing over 260 pounds, Morrison had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through intimidation backed by superior size and strength. But as he approached Sam's cabin, he was walking into a tactical situation that had been designed by someone whose expertise in lethal applications exceeded anything Morrison had ever imagined. "Sam Parsons," Morrison called toward the cabin, his voice carrying across the mountain stillness with the aggressive authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You and me need to have a conversation about the chemical games you've been playing on my property. Time to settle this business like men instead of hiding behind your laboratory tricks." Sam appeared in his cabin doorway, still wearing the work clothes of a mountain farmer, his small stature and unremarkable appearance creating a visual contrast with Morrison's imposing physical presence that would have been almost comical, if not for the deadly seriousness of what was about to unfold. But Sam's eyes carried something that Morrison had never learned to recognize: the absolute calm of someone who possessed knowledge that made physical advantages irrelevant. "Tom," Sam said quietly, his voice carrying across the clearing without any of the tension or fear that Morrison had expected from someone facing superior size and firepower. "You drove up here to threaten my family with that shotgun because you're too stupid to understand that some problems can't be solved through intimidation. But you're about to receive an education in chemistry that's going to redefine your understanding of who's really in control of this situation." Morrison raised the shotgun, pointing it directly at Sam's chest with the practiced ease of someone who'd used weapons to resolve disputes throughout his adult life. "Listen here, you little freak. I don't know what kind of chemical warfare bullshit you learned in the Army, but this is West Virginia. And in these mountains, the biggest man with the biggest gun makes the decisions. You're going to undo whatever you did to my property, pay for my crop losses, and then you're going to sell me your land for whatever price I decide is fair." Sam's response came with a slight smile that Morrison would remember for the rest of his rapidly shortening life. "Tom, you just made three crucial mistakes. First, you assumed that pointing a gun at me gives you control of this situation. Second, you thought that my military experience was limited to what you call chemical warfare bullshit. And third, you forgot that we've been having this conversation for exactly long enough for the compounds I released when you got out of your truck to reach effective concentration in your bloodstream." Morrison felt the first symptoms as Sam finished speaking: a slight tingling in his extremities, followed by a difficulty focusing his vision on the cabin door, where his target stood apparently unconcerned about the weapon pointed at his chest. The shotgun suddenly felt heavier than it should, and Morrison's hands began trembling in ways that had nothing to do with adrenaline or anger. "What the hell did you do to me?" Morrison demanded, though his voice carried less authority than it had moments earlier. The confident aggression that had sustained him through decades of physical dominance was being replaced by the growing realization that he was facing an opponent whose capabilities extended far beyond anything he'd anticipated. Sam's explanation was delivered with the patient tone of someone teaching a lesson to a student who'd been too arrogant to understand the subject material. "Tom, the compound you've been breathing for the last 3 minutes is derived from castor beans, refined through techniques I learned from German prisoners who understood chemical applications better than any agricultural college professor. It's completely undetectable until it reaches effective concentration, and once it's in your system, you have approximately 15 minutes before respiratory paralysis becomes irreversible." Morrison tried to maintain his grip on the shotgun, but his fingers were losing sensation rapidly, and the weapon's weight was becoming impossible to manage. He'd spent his entire adult life believing that superior size and strength could overcome any opponent, but he was discovering that some kinds of knowledge made physical advantages meaningless. "You poisoned me," Morrison gasped, struggling to keep the shotgun pointed in Sam's general direction, even as his motor control deteriorated. "You're going to murder me with some kind of chemical weapon." Sam stepped closer, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone whose tactical preparation had eliminated every advantage his opponent might have possessed. "Tom, I'm not murdering you. I'm defending my family against a man who came to my property with a weapon, threatening violence against people who never did anything except refuse to be intimidated by your bullying." Morrison sank to his knees as the compound continued its systematic attack on his nervous system, the shotgun falling from hands that could no longer maintain their grip on anything more substantial than memory. His breathing was becoming labored, and his vision was narrowing to a tunnel that seemed focused on Sam's face, which showed no more emotion than if he were observing the death of an insect. "The beauty of ricin derivative," Sam continued in his calm, educational tone, "is that it creates symptoms that medical examiners will attribute to natural heart failure, especially in a man your size who's obviously been under considerable stress. Your wife will collect life insurance money. Your children won't be burdened with the knowledge that their father died because he was too stupid to understand his own limitations. And the community will remember you as someone who unfortunately succumbed to the pressures of modern agricultural competition." Morrison tried to speak, to threaten some kind of retaliation that would restore his sense of control, but his vocal cords were no longer responding to conscious direction. The man who had dominated every physical confrontation of his adult life was dying in the dirt of his opponent's yard, killed by knowledge that he'd never respected and expertise that he'd never imagined could be turned against him. "You see, Tom," Sam said as Morrison's breathing became increasingly erratic, "the real difference between us was never measured in inches of height or pounds of weight. The difference was that I spent years learning how to eliminate opponents who possessed every physical advantage except intelligence. While you spent years believing that size and strength were the only kinds of power that mattered." Morrison's final conscious thought was the realization that Samuel Parsons had been playing a completely different game from the beginning, using agricultural expertise as camouflage for capabilities that extended far beyond botanical sabotage into areas where knowledge meant life or death, and preparation meant the difference between victory and complete destruction. The mountain silence returned as Morrison's breathing finally stopped, leaving only the sound of wind through chestnut trees that had watched men kill each other for reasons they couldn't understand, since before Europeans had arrived to claim ownership of land that had belonged to no one and everyone for thousands of years. Sam stood over Morrison's body for several minutes, not from any sense of satisfaction or regret, but from tactical necessity to ensure that the threat to his family had been completely eliminated. Morrison's death would be discovered in the morning by neighbors who would assume he'd suffered heart failure while visiting Sam to discuss agricultural matters. The medical examiner would find evidence of cardiovascular stress that was entirely consistent with Morrison's known health problems, and the community would mourn the loss of a man who'd apparently worked himself to death trying to solve farming problems that had proven beyond his expertise. 2 hours later, Sam had loaded Morrison's body into the truck and driven it back to Morrison's property, positioning everything to suggest that Morrison had experienced fatal heart problems while working late in his barn. The scene would tell a story of tragic overwork and stress-related death that no medical examination would question, leaving Morrison's family with insurance money and community sympathy rather than the knowledge that their husband and father had died because he'd underestimated an opponent whose capabilities extended far beyond academic agriculture. Sam returned home as the first light of dawn began filtering through the Blue Ridge Mountains, carrying with it the promise of spring planting season and the knowledge that his family's livelihood was now secure from external threats. Morrison's agricultural operation would probably be sold to pay debts accumulated through 6 months of crop failures, ensuring that no one would continue his campaign of botanical sabotage against properties that represented generations of patient work and accumulated expertise. The chestnut trees that Morrison had poisoned would recover, given time and proper treatment. Sam's reputation as an expert grower would be enhanced by his apparent ability to restore trees that other agriculturalists had pronounced unsalvageable. And the Parsons family would continue living according to mountain values that measured men by their knowledge rather than their size, their character rather than their physical advantages, and their ability to protect their loved ones through whatever methods proved necessary. Margaret and the children returned from Charleston 3 weeks later, accepting Sam's explanation that Morrison's unexpected death had eliminated the business conflicts that had threatened their family's security. The community mourned Morrison's passing while quietly acknowledging that some problems resolved themselves when people pushed conflicts beyond what intelligent resolution could accommodate. Sam never spoke publicly about the real cause of Morrison's death, but word gradually spread through the mountain network that Samuel Parsons was not a man to be threatened or underestimated, regardless of his physical appearance or academic demeanor. Other potential rivals who might have considered challenging the Parsons family's agricultural success decided that business competition had natural limits that wise people respected. The legend of the deadliest dwarf in Appalachian history became part of a mountain folklore, told around fires during long winters and passed down through generations of families who understood that knowledge combined with determination could overcome any disadvantage that nature or society might impose. Children learned that size didn't determine worth, that intelligence was more powerful than strength, and that some people were far more dangerous than their appearance suggested. Sam Parsons lived another 37 years, during which his chestnut groves became legendary throughout the eastern United States for their productivity and quality. He published agricultural papers that influenced farming practices across multiple states, consulted with government agencies about sustainable forestry management, and earned recognition as one of the most knowledgeable botanists of his generation. But those who knew the complete story understood that Sam's greatest achievement wasn't agricultural success or academic recognition. His greatest achievement was demonstrating that mountain families could still protect themselves against external threats through methods that legal authorities couldn't prosecute or prevent, Ensuring that traditional values survived in communities that refused to accept that physical size or social position determined who could be threatened and who was too dangerous to challenge. The chestnut giants continued growing for decades after Morrison's death, their massive canopies shading Sam's children and grandchildren, who learned that some traditions were worth defending through whatever means proved necessary, and that some opponents were more dangerous than any physical appearance could suggest. The mountain had protected its own, and the legend of Samuel Benjamin Parsons would be told for generations as proof that intelligence, preparation, and absolute determination could overcome any advantage that size, strength, or social position might provide.